your attention to the following. There's a mistake. There's a mistake in session 6. Session 6. Session 6 is supposed to begin at 11 and not 11:30. So please correct it. Please correct it. 11. Session 6 begins at 11 and ends at 12:30. And then 12:30 until 2 is a long and relaxed lunch break. However, are you with me? Session 6 begins at 11, ends at 12:30. Then we have a relaxed lunch break. But lunch is taken at the field school dining room, which is a bit of a walking distance. So don't think that you have all the time in the world. You have to plan it. And then we adjourn at 2 until 3:30 for session 7. And then immediately afterwards, without a break, maximum we'll take a coffee. We'll see people are really tired. I think we can manage 2.5 hours without coffee or tea. Maybe not everyone can manage, but most of us will do an effort. The Italians cannot, of course, for those who are married with Italians. Anyhow, we do intend to continue immediately afterwards. So please note 2 to 3:30, and then immediately afterwards we will just sit around the table and have our discussion, a roundtable discussion, and there are some ideas, and then we'll have the final record, which will be a nice candle lighting and maybe some videos. Who knows? Okay. So did you correct 11, not 11? יפה. Okay.
All right, everyone. So we are running a little bit behind schedule, but not too bad. So welcome back to day 3, the closing day of the joint workshop between Mali and Mali, Canada. The designations are becoming infectious because they are really so catchy. So it's a pleasure to bring you the first panel of the day, which features 3 presenters. And I'm going to read out their names. And as we established the day before yesterday, I will ask each of them to briefly say in no more than 2 sentences about their affiliation, which school, which department they are coming from, so that can help us to connect with everyone. Very quickly, from my left, you have Professor Paula Kabalo, in the middle, Aviad Moreno, and on my right, you have Esther Meir-Glitzenstein. The rules are the same as we established 2 days ago. But after consultation with Paula, instead of giving each speaker 20 minutes, we are formalizing that each of them will have 21 minutes and 30 seconds. So that means that this is a...
That's my precedence. What can we do?
So this is a sharp and hard constraint. 21 and a half minutes. I will ask you to stop. And of course, there will be plenty of time for questions and hopefully also for answers. And without further ado, Paula, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Chaba. And let me just clarify that I'm presenting, this is pretty much the first time I'm presenting this topic, which happens to be, I would say, 30% of a new project that I'm engaged in, which is the idea of looking at voluntary, mostly grassroots civic associations that were put together by 3 different groups in Israeli society. Today I will focus on immigrants from Muslim countries, and the 2 other, let's say, associational groups that I am looking at in this project is one is the voluntary associations under the military administration, Arab voluntary initiatives under the military administration, and the 3rd group is all kinds of local neighborhood associations in the margins of the big cities. But today I will focus on immigrants, and usually I do not talk about immigrants, but I have my 2 colleagues here to help me out. If you ask me questions that I cannot answer, they are the experts on immigrants of Muslim countries. My field, as some of you might know, is the field of voluntary associations. So the phenomenon that I wish to illustrate in my lecture today is a salient and far-reaching pattern of association forming among immigrant communities on the basis of countries of origin. A process that accompanied the coalescence of Israeli society even before statehood, and all the more so afterwards. They were formally established associations that operated by means of representatives and spokespersons and strove to mediate between the population group that they represented and the state authorities that dealt with immigration and its integration. In my remarks today, I will focus on organizations that represented immigrants from Muslim countries. Interestingly, although a few of the members of or leaders of these entities have lived under democratic regimes, they established organizations that operated on the basis of democratic principles: election of representatives, holding members' assemblies, freedom of expression. All of them, or mostly, articulated their positions publicly and openly, and were not deterred from criticizing policymakers, even those in the highest of echelons, of, I will demonstrate in the following words. Several additional details about the characteristics of these organizations deserve to mention. They operated on a voluntary basis from the very first day of Israeli sovereignty, and in fact, the phenomena existed way before. I can elaborate on that later on if you're interested, but when I say the phenomena existed before, I'm referring also particularly to the phenomena of immigrants from Muslim countries that organized in the 40s before statehood. And they relied on scanty financial resources that they scrapped together from random provisional allocations that various state authorities gave them, and from donations from members of their community who had immigrated before or earlier. Many of these associations refrained from charging membership fees because their members had very limited means of living, and those that did charge dues did so in measured sums. Many of them had branches around the country, many in the peripheral towns where the newcomers from these countries had been settled. So why is it of any importance, or why do I claim that this is an important field? And those of you who know me, I've been claiming this since 2001. Pretty much most of my career was based on looking at associations, voluntary associations from various fields and various time frames in Israel's history. So number one, the extent of the phenomena, when I'm looking at this particular aspect of voluntary association, the extent of the phenomenon challenges in a way the conventional image in research on the immigration to Israel from Islamic countries. Above all, that of a kind of a passive, faceless population that depended totally on the mercies of the government and had no voice of its own. Here, of course, I join Orit Rosin in her last book in suggesting that the immigrants, and mainly through the immigrant organizations, had these settings provided the newcomers a voice. With a voice, Orit looked at letters, individual letters, and I'm looking at collective actions organized by these groups. So Orit and I are planning our joint research because we really found things from different, let's say, we started the journey from two different sides, and we met in the middle. It was very clear that we find the same phenomena. This voice that was declared by these organizations was one that they made sure to invoke by means of their own representatives, doing so very soon after they reached the country. I will demonstrate some examples. The possibility, this leads to another thought, and that is that the possibility that the volunteer organizations' pressure and contact with authority maybe, at least to some extent, it paid off and influenced policymakers' agendas, leading to an additional assumption, and that is that immigrant absorption policy was not fully crafted in a top-down manner. This is points to ponder. Now, if we accept these theses, it becomes arguable that the associative activities of immigrants in Israel played a role in shaping the norms of the Israeli democratic culture. Now, here I will not go at all into theoretical models, but again, I can elaborate on that. I can tell you that I am leaning on a very rich and broad bulk of literature that could be titled as Associations and Democracy. And Mark Warren is the model that I like the best, but there are many others, Cohen and Rogers, and I can list them, but I'm in a way, I consider myself part of this school of thought. The awareness of the possibility of associating and the use of the small and particularistic associations to promote an interest, a need, or a solution to hardship or distress, all of these served as a tool for individuals in coping with the immigration plight. Now, in the rest of the lecture, I will contemplate the activity of organizations of immigrants from Islamic countries in two dimensions of activity. There were more, but I will focus today on two. One is advocacy, and the other one is involvement in current affairs. So let's begin with advocacy. Less than a year after Israel's declaration, and shortly before the Knesset, the first Knesset was, shortly after the first Knesset was, anyhow, during the last months of 1949, an organization self-titled the Association of North African and Francophone Immigrants announced its establishment. From its first moment, its representatives sent letters, memoranda, and requests for meetings to the Prime Minister and the Minister of Police, Prime Minister Ben-Gurion and Minister of Police Bechor Shitrit, which of course they considered to be part of their potential community or potential support in the Knesset. When the request for meeting with Ben-Gurion went unrequited, they bluntly expressed criticism of Ben-Gurion's decision, and they wrote him this letter, and I will quote in length because I think it's a powerful text. We are fully aware of the burden and the important work that rests on the Prime Minister's shoulders. But we are amazed that our cause is not included among the most important problems, and that the interview that we requested in every possible manner has not been approved. We did not want to announce the decision of His Excellency, the Prime Minister, to the members of our population because we are concerned that they will interpret the reply as indifference for taking an interest in our case. With all due humility, we allow ourselves to remind His Excellency, the Prime Minister, that we have had the honor of being received for an interview with the Sultan of Morocco and the High Commissioner of the Government of France as the representatives and defenders of Moroccan Jewry. And now, in our state, Israel, His Excellency, the Prime Minister, does not wish to receive us for an interview. We remind him that the situation of our brothers from Northern Africa is becoming more and more complicated from day to day and has evolved into a genuine crisis. The French consul is being flooded with requests to allow those who so request to return to Morocco, and reports reaching us from Morocco indicate that a struggle and an unprecedented panic are taking place there. Now, I will not go into details into this letter. Let me just say it was written in 1949. And I had to double check it because I wasn't sure it could be that already in 1949 the letter is written, but this is when it was written. The Prime Minister's Secretary asked the immigrants delegates to produce a written list of the matters that they wish to present to the Prime Minister, and in response, they sent an 8-page memorandum where they explained that the purpose of creating an organization was the product, and I quote, of the sense of absolute need for an organization that will safeguard the interests and the rights of the North African immigrants who are oppressed and subjected to maltreatment in Israel. We demand that those in charge, to which we had given timely warning and which did not act as they should have, they should settle matters by adopting the solution proposed at the end of this report, doing so with the utmost speed so that it not be too late. In the action plan, they emphasize that only experts from Northern Africa itself could and should solve the problems of this immigrant population, and that only they could do so without policy twists, but rather and solely national Zionist and Jewish terms. And this was an implicit criticism of the partisan biases that typified all state authorities during those years. The association was headed by immigrants from Morocco, but they wished to speak on behalf of all newcomers from Northern Africa. As I continue, I will show that they did not always succeed in this respect. Ultimately, their umbrella initiative didn't stop Jews from Tunisia, Algeria, and Libya to organize separately as well. At an assembly called the Association of Algerian Immigrants, now I'm jumping to the 60s, July 1963, the governmental and Jewish agency institutions were urged to prevent immigrants from feeling lonely. Instead, they should be received in pleasantness and solidarity, it followed. The association also demanded an official briefing for each arriving immigrant, as well as details about their rights and obligations in their own language. The Algerian Immigrants Association also held a mirror up to the policymakers by describing the cumbersome bureaucratic treatment of Algerian Jewish business people and entrepreneurs that were receiving in the process, the difficulties that they were receiving in the process of immigration. Some of this activity took place at the local level in towns where immigrants had settled, in particular large numbers, for example, Beersheba, which we visited yesterday. So the Beersheba branch of the Union of North African Immigrants organization in Israel acted particularly or specifically to find permanent housing for large families. And again, they not only demanded to provide better housing, but also pointed out on housing of possibilities because they were living there. So they knew that there were houses that were given to others instead of to immigrants, and they were accusing the officials for being corrupt and not doing their jobs. Interestingly, another thing that comes out of the Beersheba branch is that they also stressed the problem was exposing them to pressure from their own population, and the fact that these people were referring to them as their representatives and were criticizing them, meaning the heads of the organization, for not representing their cause in an efficient way vis-a-vis the authorities. Officials at the municipality of Hulon initiated a meeting in 67, now we're in 67, with the heads of the Association of Immigrants from Egypt, after the members of the association turned to the Prime Minister, at the time it was Eshkol, about what they called contemptuous treatment of the Egyptian immigrant community at the local welfare bureau. Hulon City Hall emphasized its willingness to cooperate with a volunteer organization and asked a representative of the association to present his claims. The envoy alleged that the local bureau was heedless to the association's recommendations and was not sharing its representatives into efforts to deal with Egyptian immigrants' problems. The immigrants' organizations did not limit themselves to narrow field of bettering their own members living. I mean, the Egyptians, the North African, I did not mention Tunisians and Libyans, but the Tunisians were very, very active. And all of them, I have to say, did not limit themselves only to the narrow field of bettering their members' living conditions. They also considered themselves public emissaries, duty-bound to urge the authorities to rescue distressed communities or alternatively deal with manifestations of discrimination and exclusion. And now I want to move on to the other level of activity, which is dealing with what I call current affairs, and in a minute I'll explain what do I mean by that. So the Association of North African Immigrants warned against the menace of racism and discrimination. Again, it's quite surprising, for me at least, to see how early this begins. They already responded to the famous articles by Aryeh Gelblum that were published in the spring of 1949, and they were saying that they contain defamation, gossip, and libel against the North African immigrants, and they demanded the establishment of an investigation committee in regard of all these accusations. If I move on to the immigrants from Iraq, the Organization of Immigrants from Iraq, they disseminated a letter among all members of the Knesset, beginning of the 60s, describing the arbitrary conduct of the bureaucrats at the Jerusalem Welfare Department, calling the department Olympus, claiming that they are sitting on the Olympus to demonstrate the clerks' patronizing a non-empathetic empathetic approach towards those whom they served. The allegations against the department staff was what they decried it as they discriminate and apply ridiculous double standards. That's what they claim. Another demand, another voice referring to discrimination based on ethnicity came from the Yemenite Jews. The organization of Yemenite Jews in Israel approached Prime Minister Ben-Gurion in the summer of 1962 and recounted a clash that took place between Yemenite Jewish Ashkenazi Yemenite and Ashkenazi tenants in one building in Tel Aviv. They received a complaint from their members, and they presented the complaint to Ben-Gurion. The harsh treatment that the Yemenite tenants received, they alleged, and now quote, flows for the Yemenites, that's their words, those are their words, flow from the Yemenites' black pigmentation and unwillingness of our Ashkenazi brethren to live in their company. They drew the connection between the specific case and the universal phenomena of racism, and the petitioners held up the enlightened world as an example. Out there, governments have found the wisdom, and I quote, to banish the racist bacterium, החיידק הגזעני, from the hearts of people who have taken up respectable positions. And only in the state of Israel do these people manage to be free in various places, with heads held high, unresponsive, and even being fed from the funds of the taxpayers, among whom we are numbered, say the Yemenite representatives. Therefore, they asked Ben-Gurion to intervene immediately and call the matter to the government's attention. Another aspect of involvement in current affairs was initiative of Vaad Olei Kamishli v'Netzivin from northern Syria on the Turkish border, where the Jews were enduring grievous persecution and strict isolation. The community's representatives in Israel went through an endless runaround among offices from senior officials, from one to the other, and they also appealed directly to the chair of the World Zionist Organization, to Nachum Goldman, and of course to Israel government ministries and members of the Knesset. In one case, representatives of the committee met with the head of the Jewish agency, Immigrant Absorption Department, and they were invited to the session. There was a whole session, and they were invited, and they also were allowed to bring alongside with them a recent immigrant from Syria, from that area, who gave a first-hand testimony about the goings-on in that part of Syria and the tortures and suffering that had become standard fare for the Jews there. The committee drew up a list. Another thing that they did was to prepare a list of Jews who had undergone abuse and physical injury by one of the officials in the Syrian regime, and they insisted that they also insisted that one of their members with representatives will be involved, that they will be involved in the rescue operations. Now, I will not elaborate here, but there were lots of things going behind the scenes. What is interesting from my perspective is that when you see the correspondence, you see all kinds of correspondence behind the scenes when the Ministry of Foreign Affairs interferes and says to Goldman and other people, wait, there's clandestine operations taking place behind the scenes, and we can't tell them everything that is happening because, you know, the Jews from Syria were, in fact, in the process of being rescued at the time, or at least there were attempts, not always successful, and there were issues that they could not share with the civilians, so they were finding all kinds of ways to send them the message. They could not ignore, what is interesting is that they were trying to find ways to share the Vaad Yehudei Netzivin v'Kamishli in the process. So, what can we say about the roles of associations of immigrants from Muslim countries in Israeli early years, and what does it teach us about their contribution to civic leverage and identity preservation? The organization made it their business to apprise their members of their entitlements and to share information with the authorities about their constituents' agonies. They demanded recognition as an official and agreed upon representative of those who sent them, and insisted that they be kept in the loop whenever the group's interests were discussed at the local or national level. It appears that representatives were held accountable to the membership, people who represented a diverse socioeconomic spectrum of citizens. In many cases, they personally experienced high-handed treatment from the authorities that sensed their weakness and rank-and-file citizens as rank-and-file citizens in view of bureaucratic mechanisms that tended to estrange themselves from individuals and their distress. Whether their struggle succeeded or failed, and of course we have to admit that many times their struggles failed, They did not confront authorities empty-handed and as anonymous, voiceless individuals. Their voices were heard. The agents of those who had formed these associations maintained communication with the professional bureaucracy, met with local national policymakers, and in various cases flooded their problems in the media, the Knesset, and town councils. The immigrant organizations were able to play a role. The fact that the immigrant organizations were able to play a role at all, I believe, is mainly due because the Israeli political system, with all its weaknesses and doubts and I would say patronizing approaches, recognized their position as speakers on behalf of their constituencies. No one doubted that. That's something that is very consistent in the materials. And consequently, the circle of participants in the democratic game widened. And perhaps this should be understood as the first step, maybe. Now I'm throwing a thought, and maybe we can consider this as the first step towards their significant involvement in mainstream politics in years to come. And maybe looking at Israeli politics today and looking at the number of second generation of immigrants has to do this way or another with that example, or those norms that they experience in earlier stages of their immigration experiences, or their parents. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paula. And special thanks for setting such a nice example for the rest of the panel to follow the time-bound rules. Thank you. Aviad, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me just see if I So, thank you, Paula, for inviting me to this very exciting workshop, and thank you for your fascinating presentation. I thought about how I should start out, and I think the theme of this workshop really merits a personal story as an introduction. I grew up in Beersheba, within a rather homogeneous North African environment. I myself, a son of a Moroccan immigrant who arrived in Beersheba. And in the 1980s, I remember, so I grew up in the 1980s. In the 1990s, I remember that as a teenager, we traveled to Venezuela to attend my uncle's wedding. He had immigrated there from Morocco previously. And during my visit to Venezuela, I remember a specific incident that really amazed me, and that was during the wedding itself. During the Henna celebration, Henna is as I think you may know, it's a Jewish Moroccan, not just Jewish, a Moroccan costume to apply dye to the brides and grooms' palms during the celebration. During that celebration, I made a ceremony singing of Jewish Moroccan songs, some of them in Arabic, in Judeo-Arabic. Blessing for the IDF soldier was recited, followed by the singing of the Israeli national anthem. And I was really struck, I was caught off guard by the implication of this performance of ethnicity in Venezuela as a teenager who came from Israel. And I will try to explain why I was so amazed by this, as an Israeli. So, as you all know, just a small number of Jewish inhabitants remain in Muslim lands in Morocco today. Morocco had been the largest center of Jewish life in the Muslim world prior to 1948. And about 80% of the Jewish population from Morocco left for Israel in light of the erupting Arab-Israeli conflict. And the scholarly and popular orthodoxies concerning the motivation behind this immigration are focused on the role of the State of Israel in redeeming this population from the backwards, hostile Muslim environments. This argument continues by bringing them to Israel. They enabled these Jews to undergo a slow, intricate, but a desired modernization process. And in some cases, it was the Ashkenazi-dominated Zionist agencies that were seen as responsible for rejuvenating their pre-modern religious concept of Zionism. This is in broad. By contrast, I think, mainly in the 1980s, much of the scholarly and popular critical discourses have depicted Jews from Muslim lands as victims of the European Zionist venture, which mostly, this is very broad, very rough, in its intention to redeem them from their hostile environments, in fact uprooted them from their Middle Eastern, Oriental, Mizrahi environments. Okay. Despite the zero-sum nature of these opposing perspectives on the migration of Jews from Arab Muslim lands, I think they all seem to share several outlines. First of all, migration is analyzed from the top down as a direct offshoot of the Arab-Israeli conflict and related policy making in the mid-20th century. And as a consequence, the immigrants themselves are reduced to the role of basically passive players, even pawns who had little to do with shaping their own migration processes. And thus, immigration options and assimilation destinies of these uprooted population are rigidly predetermined by their fixed identities. It is Zionist Jews who basically yearn for Aliyah, whereas the Mizrahi Jews are victims of Israel. And as a result, and this is really repetitive, these immigrations and specifically Aliyah cases are seen as sui generis Jewish migrations, unrelated to the global development of Jewish and non-Jewish migration over the last 200 years. And what I'm doing in broad is I zoom in on the diversity of migration histories across this region in order to show how they may challenge these and other taxonomies that dominate the accounts on Jewish migration from Muslim lands. And today I'll be focusing on Venezuela as the central destination for Jewish migration to Latin America during the late 1940s through the late 1960s. By the 1970s, by the way, the Moroccan Jews established a community of almost 500 descendants, which was half of the Jewish population in Venezuela. This is despite the lack of bilateral relations between Morocco and Venezuela. And the wellspring of this migration, as you can see here on the map, it was the northern region dominated by Spain between 1912 and 1956. It was a Spanish-speaking zone with plenty of Spanish immigrants, non-Jewish Spanish immigrants at the time. Now, one would wonder why Venezuela of all countries and why northern Morocco of all regions in Morocco in that case. And I think the common hypothesis is that Venezuela was a Spanish-speaking country with a flourishing petroleum industry at the time. It therefore attracted the modernized Spanish-speaking Jews of northern Morocco who came under Spanish rule in the early half of the 20th century. However, the case of Venezuela raises tougher questions as to why this South American country, like Israel, attracted only Jews from Morocco, rather than the non-Jewish inhabitants or settlers, as in the case of Spain, France, Canada, as you all may know, and other locations, Belgium, Switzerland. Venezuela was rather unique in this case. And another tougher question, I think, is how can we explain the fact that many of these immigrants were specifically Zionist activists back in Morocco and following their migration? So I maintain here and other cases I've examined that Jewish immigration to Venezuela cannot be understood without probing the Jewish Moroccan network, ethnic network that began to evolve already in the 19th century, which I roughly map here. I will not spend time on this, but maybe in the question and answer period. So, what pertains to Venezuela? The first signs of Jewish Moroccan presence in Venezuela date back to the 1930s, following the country's independence from Spain. Jews from northern Morocco simply began to join the mass waves of non-Jewish immigration from the nearby Iberian Peninsula. In Venezuela and other Latin American destinations, including mostly Brazil and Argentina, most Moroccan Jewish immigrants started out as peddlers. On the vast Caribbean seaboard and interlands across which they were scattered in that country, a casual meeting with a friend or a relative from northern Morocco underscored their common ethnic background as Jews from Morocco. And over time, more organized gathering became a social ethnic practice. For instance, in 1907, a group of immigrants from Morocco founded in Caracas, the capital city, the Sociedad Sefardí de Beneficencia. That was the Sephardic Welfare Society, the first one in the country, with 179 affiliated Moroccan immigrants, members. Such global developments in Latin America influenced Jewish organization and diasporic awareness back in Morocco, as I argued. Just for example, the Achnasat Orchim Society, established in Tangier, northern Morocco in 1911, was responsible for lodging traveling rabbis and religious scholars, other communal functions, and it had a network of fundraising emissaries operating in 16 cities across the world. In 1921, this society purchased land in a very luxurious area of Tangier on the Marchand, looking towards Europe, where 40 guest cabins and a synagogue and a mikveh were built, all with special funds from Venezuela, for Moroccan Jews in Venezuela. This is just one example. So how did these pre-1948 developments affect the post-1948 Jewish immigration from Morocco to Latin America or Venezuela, which was the main destination? So in the mid-1940s, as we know, Venezuela witnessed an economic boom, mostly due to its flourishing petroleum industry. During the 1950s, Venezuela's steadily growing industrialization widened the gap between this country and its Latin American neighbors. The country became an haven for European immigrants, mostly from Spain, as the government adopted an open door policy until 1948. This specific global development were acknowledged in Morocco, as I saw as indicated by my examination of periodicals from there. For instance, the most widespread daily newspapers in northern Morocco, España and El Dia, published articles concerning Venezuela's economic boom, internal political affairs, immigration policy, and they even included advertising for ships sailing to Venezuela or even flights to that destination. And as I argue, this information could more easily generate migration aspiration among local Jews than among their non-Jewish neighbors. One reason for that was a strongly bonded ethnic network that allowed a Jewish individual in northern Morocco to cast much of his migration aspiration to Venezuela on his ethnic background. Just for instance, in 1956, Moroccan immigrants in Caracas, who had settled there a few decades earlier, laid the cornerstone for a new great Moroccan synagogue. And El Mundo Israelita, established by Moroccan Jews, the main Jewish newspaper in Venezuela, published the event on its main page. And the photograph shows a family who had recently arrived from Morocco, standing next to the editor of El Mundo Israelita, who happened to be their close relative. And other communal functions, including Mu'alim and Shochatim and Chazanim, they all use this platform to advertise their communal services, along with other advertisements for textile businesses and insurance agencies, typical for this specific group of immigrants since the early 20th century. In the late 1960s, an association called Asociación Israelita de Venezuela, this is the acronym, AIV, founded also by Moroccan immigrants 3 decades earlier, declared itself as responsible for receiving the immigrants, advising them, helping them, etc., finding jobs and other things. And I found, this is the main issue, I found in the AIV's office several business cards of Moroccan immigrants amid other publications issued and funded by this specific association, and all publications fostered a discourse on the Jewish aspects of the pre-immigration lives in Morocco, alongside expressed interest in the history of Zionism and the state of Israel in Venezuela. This is the 1960s, and then 70s. And this brings into focus the second question I raised earlier, and this is the question of why Moroccan Jewish immigrants adopted modern Zionist identities in the course of their immigration to Venezuela, even without being subjected to Israel's melting pot strategy. I remind you that many scholars, post-colonial scholars, would suggest that this was the main factor that forced Moroccan Jews to adopt such identities while denouncing their Mizrahi Moroccan identities. But for most Moroccan Jews in northern Morocco, their connection to Venezuela was based, beyond personal ties of course, on a sense of belonging to a distinct ethnic religious diasporic web. And this web included Zionist affiliations. Small wonder that Luz, one of the main Zionist periodicals from northern Morocco, was circulated within this web, including mostly Venezuela. During the 1940s, various Zionist-oriented youth movements, including Dror, Bnei Akiva, Shomer HaTzair, all struck ground in northern Morocco. And the Bachad movement, acronym from Brit Chalutzim Datiyim, constituted a religious-oriented alternative for a more secular youth movement in that city. And here's a photo from one of their excursions to Israel. I couldn't tell, but I think this is what we see here is really nearby a location. Here's a photograph with Ben-Gurion back in the 50s. And at the crossroad of these post-1948 events, as Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe also began to unfold, Zionist organizations stuck ground in Venezuela also. Branches of Keren HaYesod, Keren Kayemet, Rizzo, Hashomer HaTzair, Bnei Akiva all had hundreds of registered members in Caracas. One of the most ethnically segregated Jewish institutions in Caracas was a local Jewish school called Herzl Bialik, inaugurated in 1946. In the 1960s, according to records by Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, between 90 to 95% of local Jews enrolled their children to this institution, which was considered really prestigious because it had also applications by Lebanese and Syrian Druze and Christians population, immigrants in Venezuela. This development facilitated the immigration of Moroccan Jews, including members of Zionist youth movements that struck ground back in Morocco. Just one example. The secretary of the new branch of the Tangier Zionist Federation was particularly active in the Bachad religious movement in Morocco. And here's a letter he wrote to the Jewish agency in Jerusalem in the 50s. But he sent off many young Jews from Tangier to Israel, while he himself chose Venezuela instead, where he became the principal of Herzl Bialik after his migration to Venezuela. From there, he continued to send off young people to Israel, and at the same time to enrich the local Jewish Venezuelan network by attracting more Moroccan Jews, including his own family members and friends. Here's just one letter. I don't have time to read it, but it's really interesting. It's a letter he sent to the members of the Ba'ath movement following their excursion to Israel in 54, where he, say something about it later. Where he encourages local activists to hasten the aliyah of these Jews who participated in the excursion. But at the same time, he shared with this advocate, this friend of his, how satisfied he was with his new position at the Herzl Bialik School, which was really, I think, outstanding. And even the Davar, by the way, the Davar newspaper published in 1963, Moreno's initiative, spoke about Moreno's initiative as the principal of Herzl Bialik to send students' delegation to Israel as part of the effort to establish educational ties between his school and Israel. Anyway, in 1966, the Ashkenazi Union in Venezuela, established only in 1950s, and the Zionist Federation of Venezuela and the Moroccan-dominated AAV that I presented, all united forces under a single entity which became to be known as the Confederations of Jewish Associations of Venezuela. And one of the Confederation's primary declared mission were to strengthen links to the State of Israel. Small wonder that in 1969, during the largest waves of immigration from Morocco in light of the 67 war, the AAV, Moroccan Association, helped in facilitating the aliyah of Moroccan Jews whenever regular attempts to organize their immigration to Venezuela failed short due to legal reasons. This is just one example from the AAV's office in Venezuela. So in closing, the narrative just unfolded sheds new light on commonly held scholarly and popular assumptions that describe Jewish immigrants from Arab lands as population redeemed or uprooted by the State of Israel against the backdrop of the conflict. My perspective, I think, pinpointed the dynamic role played by transnational immigrants network, which were also trans-regional, in sustaining their own migration, including even Aliyah, as the process began to evolve or unfold. I thereby challenge scholarly orthodoxies concerning the, according to which rigid identity-related categories, such as Zionist, Mizrahi Jews, even Westernized Jews from Arab lands, serve to explain these migration and assimilation practices prior to their actual occurrence. As I showed, Moroccan affiliation intertwined with the Jewish and Zionist affiliation in the course of immigration to the West. My ongoing research, I think this might connect well to what you presented, Paula, contributes to a budding corpus of studies that place the immigration of Jews to Israel within a wider context of modern Jewish transnationalism. But there is still a conspicuous lack of research regarding the relationship between the Sephardi and Mizrahi diasporas in the America and Europe and the more prominent Mizrahi communities and their organizations here in Israel. And I'm mentioning this because I think the very fact that I grew up in Beersheba and continue to work in Beersheba, working on my research in Beersheba, still focusing on Moroccan Jews in Venezuela, this is something that led me eventually to unearth comparable and interconnected networks of Moroccan Jews in Israel, of this specific population from northern Morocco that began to organize in Israel as the global network of Jewish Moroccan emigres began to evolve since the 50s. And of course, this is something that merits further scholarly attention, which I hope to present maybe in Montreal. Thank you all for your
Thank you,
attention.
Aviad. Thank you very much. And our last speaker of the panel, not of the day, is Esther Meir-Glitzenstein.
I'm going to speak about the integration of immigrants from Arab countries, and I would like to focus on ethnic and class factors in changing circumstances, and to try to understand the big picture, not only not to focus on a specific picture. My presentation is based on my research about the integration of Iraqi Jews in Israel. I mean, this is the base of my. From here, I go on to other topics, and I do it in order to understand their unique social location. I would like to begin my presentation with two questions. The first is, what were the causes and the circumstances that brought some of the Mizrahim in Israel, most of them Iraqis, not only Iraqis? I refer also to people who came from Egypt, from Syria, from Morocco, from Tunisia, but most of them were Iraqis. As the group that I'm speaking about, what brought them to the middle class? While most of the Mizrahim, especially from North Africa, were pushed into the lower class. And the second question is, what were the characteristics of the Iraqis' integration compared with the rest of the Mizrahim, especially from North Africa, in the economic, social, and the cultural field? To deal with these two questions, I would like to examine three issues which combine the process of integration. The first issue is the human capital of the immigrants. The Iraqi immigrants were mostly old urban, and it's very important to stress this. They were old, and it doesn't mean that they came from a town, but they were very old residents of towns, and they lived for at least some generations in the town of Baghdad and Basra. Actually, since the 17th century, we find them in this town, especially since the 18th century. But they lived in the town at least some generations, and we are speaking about 80% of Iraqi Jews. They began to pass through a modernization process parallel to the reforms in the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. They were exposed to European culture since the opening of the first modern school in Baghdad, established by the Alliance Israélite Universelle in 1864. An additional step was accomplished at the end of the 19th century when a school for girls were opened, and then it spread all over Iraq. The influence of Western education expanded, and in the middle of the 20th century, on the eve of the immigrating to Israel, it included many youth, 1/3 of which were girls. The main language was Arabic, and the second language was English or French, or both of these languages. Many of these school graduates participated in the public service, in the legal and medical professions, and in local and in international commerce. About 90% of Iraq's import was in Jewish hands, and their commercial net spread from Far East to England. Of course, it's not, I focus on the Iraqis, but if you go to Egypt, to the Jews of Cairo or Alexandria or Khalab or Aleppo or Damascus or other places, you can find very similar characteristics of the Jews who lived there. So if we examine the characteristic of the North African Jews, or I would say the Jews who arrived in Israel, it's not the characteristic of the Jews in North Africa, but the Jews who arrived in Israel, we will find many differences between them and the Iraqi Jews. The main differences are in the language of the elite, French instead of Arabic in North Africa, and also the percentage of the old urban Jews in North Africa was small compared to Iraq. And if you take Casablanca for an example, most of the Jews in Casablanca were, they were not old citizens of Casablanca, first generation, maybe second generation, but most of them immigrated to Casablanca from other parts of Morocco, so it's totally different from what we speak about when we speak about Baghdad and Basra and other towns in the area. Okay. But the most important difference is that while most of the Iraqi community, 95%, arrived in Israel during 1.5 years, only the lower class and a part of the middle class arrived from North Africa, most of them new urban residents. The highly educated, well-to-do Jewish population emigrated to France, to the United States, to Canada, and to South and Latin America. So when we speak about North Africans in Israel in the 50s and in the 60s, we speak about new urban and rural Jews, about first stages of modern educational processes, and about French language and a dialect of spoken Arabic. Another issue is the absorption policy, and here I move to the part of the state of Israel. As refugees who were forced to leave their countries in the wake of the establishment of the state of Israel, and as a result of anti-Semitism, discrimination, persecutions, and the fear of pogroms, the immigrants from Arab countries were aware of not having the right to return to their countries. Also, the possibilities of emigration from Israel were minimal. On the other hand, all the Jews who arrived in Israel were defined as olim, as ideological Zionist immigrants, including the Jews from Islamic countries. I mean, all the Jews in Israel, it's not only, I mean, Jews who arrived from Europe were the same olim as Jews who came from Islamic countries. As such, they received full-fledged citizenship, including the right to vote and to be elected. And, I mean, it's not taken for granted when you speak about state of immigration. Think about the United States or other places. There you can find a different situation. I would like to add that actually the State of Israel refused to acknowledge them as the victims of the Arab-Israeli conflict, ignoring the fact that they had become hostages to Arab governments and Arab population. Israel claimed that by its very existence and by its immigration policy, it saved these Jews from economic, social, and cultural deterioration, and of course from persecutions and pogrom. Being refugees and accepting an immediate citizenship caused the new immigrants instant feelings of belonging, together with an expectation of full equality. They felt confident enough to struggle for it in accordance with the ability of each group of immigrants, and you could see it from Paula's presentation. Actually, the policy of absorption was not equal. Dispersion of population was the formal policy of the government of Israel, but as a matter of fact, it was selective. It almost didn't influence European immigrants, but it was imposed on Mizrahi groups, especially on the North Africans. When the Iraqis arrived in Israel in 1950-51, the absorption policy focused on transit camps which were dispersed all over Israel, but especially in its center, from Haifa to Rehovot, something like that, most of the transit camps. And Iraqi Jews refused to go to the periphery exactly as the Europeans. And they refused to go to agricultural settlement, not only to the periphery. They struggled in varied ways and succeeded in arriving in transit camps in the neighborhood of Tel Aviv. From there, they found their way to the wealthy towns of the area, the most well-known of which is, of course, Ramat Gan. The weakness of the political establishment enabled the Iraqis to settle in the same ways that European Jews did, only that they had to struggle for this. During the 50s, Iraqi immigrants waged many demonstrations in order to achieve better conditions in occupation, housing, and other rights. They demanded to be given the same conditions as the Europeans. The case of the Yemenites may best illustrate this process. Because they missed modern skills and couldn't refuse the government pressure, many of them were sent to labor villages in the Jerusalem mountains and in the Upper Galilee. The conditions were so hard that most of them, and you have to understand that the Yemenites, they were so poor, but, well, anyway, the conditions were so hard, so they were compelled to live and find refuge in the transit camp or in the slums around Tel Aviv. So this was the story of many Yemenites. We speak about 30 villages, labor villages in this time. Iraqi first-generation achievements ensured the second-generation place in the Israeli middle class. Already in their second decade in Israel, they were prominent in their position in public service in the same fields that had characterized them in Iraq, as clerks and officials, bookkeepers and accountants, as teachers, lawyers, medical doctors, pharmacists, etc. They worked in governmental offices, banks, public companies, etc. In addition, they were offered many positions where Arabic was necessary, both in civil and military fields. In contrast to this, North African immigrants who arrived since the mid-50s were accepted with a stiff dispersion policy that imposed on them the national task of settling the peripheries. More than 70% of the North Africans were sent to the periphery, where they established about 20 development towns and tens of agricultural villages. This location had many limited economic possibilities, such as occupation in labor-intensive factories with low salaries, political and economic dependence on a distant central government, a problematic educational system, and they were detached from the cultural center of Israel. All of these factors rooted North African immigrants to the lower class of the Jewish society. Those who succeeded in leaving the development towns usually found their way to the slums of the big city, and one example of this is Wadi Salib in Haifa. Another example is Chunat Tikva in Tel Aviv, and in other suburbs in the south of Tel Aviv and in other cities. The initial processes of mobility that characterized them in the modern cities of North Africa were stopped in the new country because, in spite of the transformations they experienced in Israel, they were still noticeably behind the advance made by the upper and middle classes in Israel. As a consequence, a large part of the second and third generations left the development towns, but their status was at least one generation behind that of the Iraqis. The third factor is the cultural policy of absorption and its consequences. From its very inception, the State of Israel exerted a heavy pressure on the immigrants to adopt Israeli culture and to erase forms, traditions, and habits brought from their countries of origin. The pressure was especially strong on Jews from Islamic countries because the cultural differences were so great. Middle-class Mizrahim were exposed to this pressure more than the lower-class Mizrahim because the former were more involved in other Israeli groups than the latter who lived in the development towns. The periphery was actually a segregated area. What were the results? If we examine the reaction of urban Iraqi immigrants vis-à-vis the absorption policy, we find that they are much more assimilated into mainstream Ashkenazic society than the North African in this way. First, most of them are secular. And when I say secular, I don't refer to their beliefs. Of course, they go to synagogue, most of them, they go to synagogue and they keep many religious commandments, but still they are more secular. Another thing, the percentage of intermarriages with Ashkenazim in the highest among the Iraqis is the highest among the Mizrahim. 30% among them, those who were born in Iraq, participated or were intermarriages, and we can compare it to 10 to 20% of other Mizrahim. And if we go to the second generation of the Iraqis, it's at least 30%, 35, 40%. It's not easy to have the data of the third and second and the third generation. It's complicated, but anyway, it's more than it was in the first generation. If we speak about demographic changes, the rate of birth decreased from an average of 5 children per woman to 2.5 for a woman. Now it's, you know that now that the direction was changed, and now it's about 3 per woman, maybe even more. Anyway, it's very similar to the Israeli Jewish average. Iraqi Jews almost entirely gave up Arabic and Arab culture. Traditional customs were kept only for family occasions, mostly among the first generation. The voting patterns of the Iraqis are similar to those of middle class in Israel. They vote for left and center parties. I mean, the Labour parties, and now it's Shinui now Kahlon, yes, it's in the middle of the political map. Iraqis of second and third generations are more highly educated than the North African. Among Iraqis of the second and the third generation, we can find characteristic forms of the middle class ethos through education as a way to social mobility combined with ambition and entrepreneurship. When we examine North African immigrants, we found out quite a different picture. Of course, I speak very, very generally, so they are more identified with the religious and cultural tradition. The rate of intermarriages with Europeans is smaller, while the rate of intermarriages among Mizrahim from different countries is higher. The rate of birth has reduced, but still higher than the average in Israel. Their accessibility to higher education is lower than that of the Iraqis who live in the center of Israel. Voting patterns, they tend to vote for right-wing parties, and also for the ethnic party of Shas. Living far away geographically and culturally from the center, the North African preserved more of the original culture, the languages, the family hierarchy, the cuisine, and other characteristics. Okay, to some conclusion. All these differences indicate class patterns of middle class versus lower class, and white collar versus blue collar. The differences between classes among immigrants from Arab countries were preserved in Israel. Those who had been middle class remained middle class, but only as a consequence of a firm and prolonged struggle. Those who had been lower class were too weak to wage a struggle, so they remained lower class. Actually, the process of mobility that had existed in their countries of origin was stopped, or at least was delayed by the absorption policy of the State of Israel. Furthermore, the interrelations between integration and assimilation are noticeable. Opening the doors to integration is a precondition to assimilation, and this is a part of the state. As the privatization process continues, the gaps between classes are widening in Israel, and also the gaps among the Mizrahim. While those integrated to the middle class have an open road to social and economic mobility, those in the lower class remain on the economic, social, and cultural margins of Israeli society. I think that from this stage on, we are less engaged with ethnic cleavage, but more with economic gaps. The fact is that while the middle class is composed of people from Europeans and Arab origin, the lower class of Israeli Jewish society is mostly Mizrahim. In short, Israeli society is now more stratified than it was. Ethnic divisions are less important, while class divisions are more evident than they were 50 or 60 years ago. Yet the ethnic problems was not disappeared, of course. I assume that it became a part of the growing socio-economic debate.
Thank you very much, Esther, for yet another thought-provoking presentation and argument. I'm going to take the questions in batches of 3. So let's take the first question. I see Arya, Ida, and Dina. And then the next batch will start with Arya.
Okay. So I have questions for everyone. I enjoyed all of the lectures, but I don't know there's a lot of people who have questions. Esther, a question for you. Thank you for your lecture. Haviva Padaya has basically read the map, I think the same way you have, described the same history. And as a consequence, she writes about the Erech HaMosaf, the added value of the periphery, wherein basically she's saying, she's coming from an Iraqi background, that the price that the Iraqi Jews paid for this assimilation was to become disconnected from the continuity of Iraqi Jewish history.
Yes.
And the benefit of marginalization has been the preservation of North African Jewish history and culture. So that today, oftentimes, the deep well springs of culture are able to emerge in the Israeli context from these North African communities. And she points, for instance, to compare the fate of Iraqi Jewish music in Israel to the different and various Andalusian orchestras that we have in the country. So I would like to hear if you found among any, if you thought about or have heard from any, or read or familiar with Iraqi Israelis who look back upon this process in their self-understanding, completing now Padaya's view, in their self-understanding, this success, this level of assimilation, as also a kind of failure in terms of the price that's been paid and the cultural discount.
Okay. Next question, Aya.
Okay, thanks to everybody. To Aviad. There is literature on Moroccan, comparative literature on Moroccan Jewish immigration to places like France and Canada as opposed to Israel. And there the prevailing wisdom is that there is a differentiation according to education and economic class. And I'm wondering if you have detected a similar division in terms of Moroccan Jews going to Venezuela as opposed to those choosing to go to Israel. To Paula, the issue of global networks brings to mind, in terms of North America and elsewhere, the early 20th century phenomenon of Landsmannschaft, where organizations of immigrants coming from a certain place get medical insurance, burial, religious benefits, as opposed. Okay, so now understanding that Hitachdut Olay, fill in the blank, is in a different context, and the large issue is representation of this lobby group before governmental officials on various levels, municipal, national, whatever. What are the other benefits that members get in their belonging to Hitachdut?
Thank you. And the last question in the first batch was to Dina.
Yeah, thank you very much. Absolutely three fascinating presentations. The question is to Paula, and in your title, you say you're interested in immigrant associations as two things, right? Medium of civic leverage and to identity preservation. And probably for time constraints, you ended up talking more about the first, with the advocacy and the involvement in current affairs, which is more the civic leverage. And I'm very interested in the identity preservation aspect. And in a way, I think it kind of relates to the other two questions, which also touch on possibly these added benefits, of having the associations, and also the question to Esther, about the identity and, the advantages and disadvantages of being in the periphery or in the center and the integration. And to Paula, are those two things in a bit of a conflict? Because if the advocacy and involvement in current affairs moves towards greater integration in the civic fabric of the state with a possible kind of Ashkenazi hegemony, the association's interest in pursuing that, is it in some conflict with the identity preservation, which harkens back possibly to where they came from?
Okay. Why don't we take the answers in the reverse order of the presentation? So Esther, do you want to?
Time to think.
Time to move on. Esther, would you like
Both questions refer to cultural situation. Actually, I know about the advantage that Iraqi had by living in the center of Israel. Actually, they struggle for it. It's not so that simple. They refuse to go to the periphery of Israel. They wage a very strong struggle to do it, and they succeeded to do it because it was in the first years of Israel. It was easier to do it. I think if we think about Haviva Pedaya and there was culturally, there was a price for this success. There is no research about it. But as far as I know, as I interviewed many people of Iraqi origin, I don't think that they care. I don't think they feel that they lost anything. This is their way. And I think that it's the continuation of something that existed in Iraq. It existed in Baghdad, maybe less in Basra. But in Baghdad, they felt modernized. I know about Eli Kaduri. Eli Kaduri left Iraq in 47 and moved to London to study. When he arrived there, he was sure that he's English, an Englishman, and he was sure that he wrote about it, and we know about it. And so when he arrived in London, he was amazed to discover that he is an Iraqi. So I think that it's not only him. This is a phenomenon. They were highly educated. A lot of them, or the elite of them, was highly educated. They consider themselves Western. They were sure that they belonged to the Western culture. And I don't think that they cared about their original culture. It's different when we speak about other groups.
If it's very brief, yes, let's not stop the
So,
conversation.
for instance, what you're saying, if I understand you, you're saying there is continuity to a enlightened and secular culture in Baghdad. What about, for instance, how do you account for the Al-Kuwaiti brothers when they arrived?
Well, you know that the Al-Kuwaiti, it's Iraqi music, Iraqi songs with connection to European musicians. I mean, they took some aspects of European music and integrated it into their music.
They had no work here, they had such a bitter
So,
experience, they forbade their children from becoming musicians.
Okay, but if you go to the second generation, the third generation, Who cares about the Kuwaitis?
I
But it's not the same, you know. It's the Israeli music. Dudu Tassa is an Israeli music.
okay.
It's a nostalgic. He has a nostalgic opinion about them, but no.
That's
Thank you.
Aviad and Paula.
Thank you so much for the question. It really makes me think about how comparable my cases and how interconnected the cases are. So first, there was a clear advantage for the Jews coming, living a Spanish-speaking zone, mainly in Morocco, and arriving into a Spanish-speaking environment with a native language. And unlike the Ashkenazi case, they arrived there as trailblazers. They established their first community in Caracas as Sephardic Jews. So they had all these kind of advantages that allowed them to integrate into the local economy, academia, and other establishments of the state with their own assets, cultural. And another example that I can think of is also their look. They look like Spanish immigrants, like non-Jewish Hispanic immigrants who were the elite of that country, of Venezuela. And nevertheless, they still preserved many of their Moroccan traditions along this process of integration in the country. And if I'm trying to compare this case to the Israeli case of Jewish immigration from northern Morocco, I would say it's quite comparable. And that's a small surprise because quite a number of Jews who arrived from northern Morocco to Israel emigrated or had emigrated to other locations, including Venezuela, before their immigration to Israel. So it's a story of middle-class immigration, which is comparable because the story is a little different than the broader story that we know about mass immigration from Morocco to Israel in the 1960s and 70s. But I do need to, think or delve deeper into the case in order to, give a more constructive answer to the question. But thank you. It's very good.
Well, first I want to say that the phenomena goes way beyond any ethnicity. It's a Jewish phenomenon. And when I looked at this, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, I found hundreds of, definitely in Tel Aviv itself, I found tens of organizations before 48 from Muslim countries. Okay? So the phenomena goes beyond any Israeli or ethnicity. It's a Jewish. Probably it goes back to Jewish origins. That's my assumption. But the nuances, as you mentioned correctly, Ira, there are nuances because if you organize in America, your expectations from the government are different. You look then you will look inwards and you will expect you will put more on your own shoulders. Now that does not mean that the ones who organized in Israel did not put on their shoulders. In fact, this morning I came at 6 o'clock to the office, and what I did was erase the whole subchapter of self-help because I knew I would not have time. So there's a whole additional angle of their activity which I titled self-help, and I demonstrate how immigrants who didn't have money whatsoever organized galas to fundraise for scholarships, and how the Tunisian Association reaches out to all of its community and asks them to raise things, clothing, mainly clothing for children. So there was a significant aspect of self-help. That's number one. However, it is correct what you said, Ira, that lobby was a major thing. So the idea was we are organizing ourselves vis-a-vis them, vis-a-vis the government, vis-a-vis the authorities. Now, what's the benefit? Because sometimes you get something, sometimes you don't, and in the bigger picture, one would claim, okay, but they didn't get enough because they were still stuck in those places, right? But I want to divide my answer of the benefits into two parts. One part is, and I'm basing here my answer on a whole bulk of literature that looks at benefits of associating. So some of the benefits are concrete. They get, more stipends for studying, and their kids are offered more boarding schools, or they do manage to provide to limit the corruption in housing units distribution, okay? Those are concrete benefits. But there's another level of benefit which is very clear not only from this research but from studies in general of associations, that there's another benefit, and that is the sense that the individual, the anonymous individual, very weakened individual has when she knows whom to approach to. So the benefit is a benefit of starting to pave your way as a citizen. That's what I'm claiming here. There's a benefit that goes beyond concrete assets, but it's a benefit of becoming a citizen of the new place by having your representative meeting with. And if you have a complaint, you go to your representative. So that's, I won't go into all the definitions, but let me just say that this is it's called in general in the field schools of democracy. In a way, individuals have a chance to participate in schools of democracy when they elect their representatives and tell them what they're bothered by, and then they're sent up. That's one thing. Identity, I do not see identity in the sense of culture preservation. That comes later, I think, Aryeh, if I'm not mistaken. But what I did see was fundraising for synagogues, and all kinds of activities that had to do with let's create our synagogue as the Tunisian, the particular synagogue, that sub-particular part of ethnic group. So that is one way that they saw, a common way that I identified as preserving identity, preserving the habits, the cultural habits, the religious cultural habits. That's one thing that I saw. Another thing is the language, demanding that the people who accept them will come from their own different groups and will be able to speak their languages. So language is there. And another thing, again, it's abstract, but the fact of the matter is that I have to say I cannot think of any group who did not organize. I mean, and some organized in various. I mean, the Yemenites had various, the Syrians had various, Turkish, Afghanistan, Kurdistan, I don't know. I mean, you name it. And one of the things that strikes me is that identity sometimes is just by the fact that you are a member. You're a member in this group that has the name of your country as the title, and which means that which declares that you are still insisting to belong to that subgroup, regardless of the fact that by the others everybody is considered North Africans or Jews from the Middle Eastern countries. So sometimes it's not so much about creating musical bands, but it's about insisting on having your own Tunisian chapter, your own Algerian chapter, your own Libyan chapter, as a claim for your old identity, I would say. Well, I could say more, but let's stop here.
Great. Because we started late, I'm going to add a few minutes to this session, so please hang tight. Coffee is coming, but not just yet. I have 4 people indicating to want to ask questions, so I will take them as the second and last batch. The first question goes to Yael, Sigal, Meir, and Nathan. Yael.
Thank you, it was really interesting. I have one comment to still maybe disagree with what Aryeh said, that I was thinking about the biography and the literary corpus of some university. And I was thinking that regarding the biography, success, and this, so to speak, integration, it might be quite similar to what you have, to the way that you have presented it, but then in the literary corpus, you do see, the sub, you do see other voices, right? And you do see his literary corpus. He has one novel, I think it was published in 2014, in which this is his, Ashkenazic mainstream novel called Ma'ofa Wabawit. But this is the only one. Then he returns to Iraq. Then after this novel, he returns to depict scenes from Iraq and so on. So I think maybe the cultural aspect, I don't know, can be integrated. Maybe it raises also other questions. And for Aviad, I was wondering, I was kind of distracted distracted by my own personal history as you were speaking, because I did, so maybe I missed something. Because I was thinking about the branch of my family that immigrated from Israel, like they're Turkish and Persian origin. They immigrated to Venezuela precisely after the economic boom in after 1948, and so I wanted to ask you, why is, and they were very Zionist, so why was the melting pot umbrella, why is the melting pot umbrella not relevant for explaining the Zionism of the Jewish immigrants to Venezuela in those years?
Not relevant?
Oh, I thought you said that it's not, that
It
it's
is
not
very
explaining.
relevant.
I thought you
It's my
said that
main
it's not
argument.
explaining.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah?
So we'll
Yeah, okay.
explore that. Okay, Sigal?
Okay, I want to relate to Esther's talk. I think it was very eye-opening, the way you described the Iraqi immigrant assimilation here. And I want, regarding to talk between you and I just want to recommend as an art scholar, there's right now a solo exhibition in Tel Aviv Museum by an artist called Tamil Tzadok. And Tamil Tzadok. And he's second generation Iraqi, half Syrian, and a quarter Iraqi, quarter Syrian, and half Ashkenazi. And despite that, he chooses to relate to his Arab identity, and he's talking about this heightened identity of Arab Jews, and his all of his exhibition, especially one film, is about his longing to become an Arab again. He is inventing, is mocking a documentary film which he is becoming a spy in Egypt, looking for an artwork, never mind. But the whole film concentrates on how he speaks Arabic to the taxi driver over there, and he presents himself as he doesn't present himself as Jewish at all, but as Arab from Syria and Iraq. And the end of the movie is showing a kind of a solo exhibition in Egypt, which his name is transformed to Tamil Tzadok. So I think the whole over of Tamil is specifically relating to his second generation longing to this lost Arabic identity.
It's second or third generation?
No, his second. His father came from Iraq, and his father is actually participating in many of his films as a figure.
Sigal, do you have a question or?
It's just a reflection.
Okay.
What do you think of my comments?
Okay, so the
What
question
do
is
you
what do
think
you
of
think of Sigal's comment?
What do you think of my
Yeah,
comment?
excellent. Thank you. Mail.
I have a question, and I would ask both Paula and Esther, maybe to engage with a thought experiment that they did not relate to in their presentation, but I would like to. And that thought experiment involves a shift in thinking and focus. Why I'm asking, after you reviewed all you have done, if you would shift your attention from the immigrants' characteristics, whatever they are, to the government, to Israeli society of that time and the government approach to them, would you say, and that's the question, that the civil rights and human rights of those people were abused?
Okay.
So for just let me state why I'm asking this question, because there is an assumption that there is a democracy in Paula's articulation, and there is a premise in Esther that there is a meritocratic system that is in operation. Both democracy and meritocracy are debunked in Israeli history in terms of the relations to, because even you said that the standards were applied to Jews who came from Arab countries, but never to Jews who came from Europe. So how can you speak about democracy? How can you speak about meritocracy And how can you speak about the immigrant characteristic, whereas you leave the main actor outside of your attention?
Okay, and the last question is Nathan.
Just a couple of points which I'd like to know your viewpoints. When, Esther, you talk about assimilation and it's often used, we often forget the word acculturation. And I think the word acculturation is more fitting, tilbut, than assimilation. It's not all or nothing. The other thing is also money. Where you follow, I think I've spoken to Esther about this, the sterling balances. Jews of Iraq were able to get some of their money out to banks in Britain, in Israel, especially Barclays. Likewise in Venezuela.
They smothered it.
Yeah. Well, they also had open also in Venezuela because of the banking system. And this is also an important element. The other thing is language. And the fact that most of the Jews in Iraq had lived under the British mandate, there was British law. Jews who come from Morocco, French law is very, very different. And of course, apart from learning the language, it was much easier in some ways for people, especially from Iraq, who had studied law, to actually resit their exams for the Israel bar than it was for Morocco. And the last thing is leadership. And that study is, to what extent do the authentic leaders from North Africa, especially Morocco, come on aliyah with the Olim, compared to, for various reasons, those who came from Iraq. Political leaders were able to organize themselves far better. And that I would like to know your points, and thank you.
We have 3 minutes, right?
We are now really behind schedule,
Yeah.
so why don't we wrap up at 1:45, and that should give you about
A minute for each.
a minute each. That's not to you, Paul.
So, Israel's democracy in the first decade was a limited and restricted democracy for anyone who was living here. Think of Tzena. The Tzena was limiting, if someone gets into you, not only into your pocket, someone gets into your pocket and says, no matter how much money you have there, you cannot buy this. That's limited democracy to anyone who was living here. Israel was under survival mode, and it limited its democracy. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that the world was in a survival mode after the democratic world after World War II was also operating limited democracy approaches. I won't go so far as talk about McCarthyism. We can talk about other examples which are more mild, but all of them demonstrate that democracy was reconsidered in the 50s in the democratic world. I'm not talking about the non-democratic world. Now, after I say that, there are other aspects of democracy who have to be tested here. Freedom of speech. Yes, they operated freedom of speech. Freedom of association. Yes, they operated freedom of association. Did they have access to decision makers? Yes, they had access to decision makers. Did they manage to bring their own people into this policy-making meetings? Yes. Now, one would say, but how could it be? I mean, they are abused. They are second-best citizens. How could it be that their representatives of the second-best citizens are invited to take part in meetings regarding the policies of the state? Well, it might say that maybe they are second-best. What I'm saying is we have to bear that in mind. We have to bear that in mind. We cannot ignore it. They had access to influence. The results, let's have in Montreal. We'll go on. We'll discuss that. Okay, we have to come to Montreal. We're coming.
We look for democracy in Montreal.
Should I?
Together.
So the 1950s and 1960s looked somewhat fishy too, by the way.
Fishy is the word.
We are not speaking about paradise.
Is this being recorded?
Shabbat, we are not speaking about paradise. We're speaking about people living.
Okay, Aviad.
Okay.
You're all invited to the ethnic democracy that is Quebec.
Yes.
Thank you. So very briefly, Yael, thank you very much for your question. I'm happy that we have much to discuss later concerning your personal history. One of my points is that the Zionist apparatus evolved to serve as a melting pot even beyond the borders of the State of Israel or territory of the State of Israel in a way that even hastened immigration of Jews to other locations. This is the network I'm trying to, delve into. So this is a small surprise that your story is similar to the story I raised. We'll discuss this later. Thank you.
Thank you, Aviad. Esther.
I was asked about identity, Iraqi identity in Israel. Sami Michael began as a communist. Now I think he is Zionist now. I mean, it's a process, very long process. Many of Iraqi Jews arrived not because they wanted to arrive here. We have to remember it. And about longing to the past, longing for being Arab Jews, well, it's so complicated. It's another, I mean, it's really complicated topic, and I think that we should dedicate another session to the question of identity. What else about the Israel was democratic? I accept what Paula said. Israel was not democratic in the 50s. I'm not sure about the 60s, but about Israel made a lot of things in the 50s that are not acceptable for a democratic country. Sending people, compelling them to do what they don't want to do, and other things. So, I'm sorry, I don't like this idea. I don't enjoy, but.
Okay, Esther, is
Yeah.
that the
Yeah.
conclusion?
Yeah.
In that case, please, let's applaud our presenters. And agenda control is back in Paula's hand.
Well, 11:05.